All right, how y'all doing? You having a good time? Yo, make some noise for Prohibition Partners, everybody. This wonderful event, we're so lucky to have them representing the UK scene here. What a wonderful event. I'm really impressed. My name's Alex Rogers. I'm the CEO and founder of the ICBC. I'm having the fortune of being on this panel, moderating this panel, with my esteemed guests here today. We're going to be talking about legacy to legal, which is, I think, a great segue to even the last panel, what that gentleman was saying. A lot of that stuff is quite germane and relevant right now. I'd like to introduce my panel members right now. Robert Veverka, he is the editor and publisher of Legalizace, a wonderful magazine out of the Czech Republic, and he's been a longtime cannabis activist. And then we've got Mr. Louis Koski, who's the CEO of Metrc and the general manager of the German subsidiary Metrc. And we've got, let me get this going here. We've got Ms. Katya Kowalski, and she's a drug policy expert with extensive experience in research, policy, and external engagement. She is head of the operations at Volteface or Face?
Volteface.
Volteface, okay. The UK's leading drug policy think tank. And then we have Mrs. Katrina Ffrench, Katrina Ffrench, and she is the founder of Unjust, and Unjust is an advocacy group here in the UK helping racialize, or just understanding that when we come into the legal market, how can the communities that have been most affected by prohibition benefit? So give it a round of applause for all of our esteemed guests, everybody. So you guys, the goal of governments should be to mitigate the use of unregulated cannabis as much as reasonably possible while setting realistic expectations for public health and government revenue outcomes. Governments need to be mindful and intentional with the laws that they set and the regulations that flow out of those laws to help ensure that regulated products can compete in a meaningful way with their unregulated counterparts. Consumers are willing to pay a bit more for the convenience and safety of regulated products we see, but there's obviously a tipping point which consumers will start to go through the unregulated sources if regulated products are too expensive or too scarce. So with that, I'll bring our first question to our regulator on the panel. Louis, what was your title in Colorado?
I was the director of the Marijuana Enforcement Division in Colorado.
Yeah, so Louis was right there at the inception when America was legalizing, and his experience is vast and invaluable. And I just want to ask you, Louis, with multiple European member states pushing for adult use legalization, Germany has been at the forefront of this. What must regulation of a commercial market look like to protect the government's interest in combating the illicit market and protecting public health while also allowing for efficient commerce?
Well, one part of that question that really sticks out to me is government's interests, and those are really hard to define. In fact, I think government's role should be bringing and convening a group of diverse stakeholders to the table to help determine what the public interest is in cannabis legalization. From many different perspectives. So drawing on some of my experience from Colorado when I led that agency, when we first legalized cannabis, we tried to bring as many diverse stakeholders as possible to the table to better understand some of the challenges that industry was facing, what were some of the challenges that members of the community were facing. Patients in particular was a stakeholder group that we had a lot of interactions with, but we would bring everybody together to public forums and have real open dialogue around cannabis legalizations, what the impacts were pre-legalization to certain communities, but what also were going to be the impacts post-legalization. So the concept is to have a shared understanding of what the public interests were, so everyone had like at least some level of buy-in to that. So from that, we learned a lot of different things. One is that there was a real need to be able to collect data that had not been collected pre-legalization. So we were already too late as we were forming regulations in Colorado to try and collect baseline data. Some very important pieces of that were missing. We also learned that it was gonna be really important for us to be able to monitor businesses efficiently so that they could so we weren't interrupting commerce in a way that was unnecessary. So try to understand the operational needs of businesses, but also it really helped us kind of inform too what some of our taxing policy and right sizing of businesses should look like, so that we could meet that balance. The real magic happens in the public policy process when government acts as a convener of shared interests to arrive at a shared understanding of what the public interests are, so that you can hit a balance where you are protecting public health, you're addressing some of the main issues around illicit activity, and also providing for sustainable business practices for members of the commercialized community.
What year were you in Colorado getting all that together originally at the inception?
I started in 2010, and I was with the agency until 2017. So we led the agency that I worked for essentially led the effort to create all the regulations that came from the constitutional amendment that allowed for legalization and then subsequent legislation.
That's awesome. I see we got the red, gold, and green here represented. Would any of y'all like to comment on what Louis said here?
Well, I think drawing on what you said about government and government having kind of a stake and being heavily involved in this, I think is really important. Kind of linked to what you've said, but on the kind of UK side of things, the government legalized medical cannabis in 2018, and we're almost 5 years later, still really limited in patient numbers. And I think a massive reason for that is a lack of government intervention in a positive way. Cannabis is still being treated very much as a recreational drug, and patients are still being criminalized for it. And there's not much appetite from government to kind of intervene and help come up with a campaign to raise awareness and to educate police officers and other government officials on the legal status of cannabis.
And why is the legacy market that much more attractive?
For a whole load of reasons. So I guess as Louis has already kind of drawn on, when a legal market's introduced, the focus really steps up towards, okay, how do we make a legal market more attractive? How do we make it better? How can we actually compete with the legacy market, which has been around for decades? And so that takes convincing amongst consumers and patients to make that change. And at Volteface, we speak to patients on a regular basis. We run market research focus groups with patients quite often. And from what we've gathered, there's a number of reasons as to why patients still access illicit or legacy market, and that's down to supply issues. It's a lot easier to ring up a dealer and get access to cannabis than it is through the current framework. Cost is a massive barrier. Speed of delivery, behavior, and just general habits. I think once you're in a particular habit, it's quite difficult to break out of. And just experience, really. And so I think all of those factors really contribute to the fact that we've got about 20,000 prescribed legally patients, whereas we've got about 1.8 million people self-medicating on an illicit market. And I think there's times...
Those numbers alone to say a lot.
I think that shows, the disparity that we've got. And I think that there is, at times, a bit of a naivety amongst the kind of legal industry, thinking that just because something's legal, it makes it automatically better, and that's why patients will switch. And we don't see that. And I think a massive reason for all of these issues is really the way in which cannabis was legalized in the UK in the first place. It happened in 2018, and it was a flash-in-the-pan, knee-jerk campaign that led to the change in policy. Really, really effective campaign, but because it just essentially happened overnight, there was a lack of groundwork and a lack of engagement from the get-go. So in terms of how we've seen it happen in the States and in other European countries, it's years and years of stakeholder engagement, engaging clinicians, engaging government officials on making a market legal, whereas in the UK it happened overnight. And I think that's a massive reason as to why now we're having to do all the groundwork with an industry that's been around for 5 years.
It's almost like for Germany, they just basically people thought they wanted them to do license regulation right away, but what they did was now we see this they're kind of putting out in stages with decrim, something that I am a big supporter of and advocate of first. So and people say, oh, they should have just gone right to license regulate, but really the fact is that they did decrim first, and now they have a social club model and then a pilot club model coming. To your point, that might actually be a better way to do things to get the market on board rather than maybe such abrupt policy decisions.
Yeah, definitely. Just kind of building from the ground up, because now we've got a legal market for the last 5 years, and a massive chunk of the UK population doesn't even know medical cannabis is legal. Whether that be patients that are medicating from the legacy market, or just people that could potentially benefit and that have no idea that you can get cannabis on prescription.
Yeah, so always awareness and education.
Yeah, absolutely.
Robert, you live in the Czech Republic, right? So we hear a lot about the Czech Republic, like we can go to Prague and get weed, you know what I'm saying? Like go to a coffee shop and get weed, and that Czech's wide open, and that Prague's wide open. But it's a little bit like Amsterdam in that these aren't codified into laws. These aren't really laws. This is more of a it's tolerated. Could you just give us tell us a little bit what you think about regulating cannabis and what you think the most important thing is coming from illegal markets to legal markets?
The thing is, when I started to promote legalization of cannabis, I always said that it's supposed to be based on personal freedom and right to grow for yourself. That the essential background, the foundation of any regulation should be based on freedom to grow or cultivate a couple of plants and possess certain amount of cannabis for personal use. It was really hard to promote such a thing, and it really was helpful that the Czech Republic was one of the first countries legalizing the medicinal cannabis in 2013, although actually it wasn't done as we wished in the beginning, because it was actually based on prohibition, while the patients could obtain medicinal cannabis through really, in that time, really difficult system. And a really important part was that it wasn't paid from insurance, health insurance. So actually it was legalized as a medicinal cannabis. It was recognized. It was really good argument actually, to promote that cannabis is not as bad as was promoted through, anti-drug propaganda. But it was really difficult for patients to obtain the cannabis because the doctors didn't want to prescribe it. It wasn't actually cultivated in the country, so it was based on import of cannabis from different places, from different parts of. Actually, it was from Canada, I believe, and also because it wasn't paid, the price was like doubled at least or tripled than it was on an illicit market, which actually didn't attract people to go for the system. It changed in 2020 when the former government actually allowed to get medical cannabis paid, which helped people, and it was seen how it rise in numbers. That a lot of patients actually went for cannabis because 1 gram would cost 20 euro cents or something like this. So that's I see as a really important. And what we try to do now, or what's happening in Czech Republic, is to create the regulation which would allow actually what is now decriminalized. So growing a couple of plants, processing the dry stuff, the yield from the cultivation. We talk about actually about 1.2 kilos you could actually have on your own in your household, and carrying 30 grams around, in public. And the other part that people, it's a good concept that people can grow, but not everybody is actually capable to grow for certain reasons. Either they don't have a property to grow, or they don't have a capability, or they don't have a money. So they should be allowed. And the idea is that they would be creating a
social club or a collective
cannabis
grow.
social clubs, concept in which means that people could actually join the club and actually let the right for personal grow, give it to someone else, the organization which will grow for them the cannabis they want to obtain. The advantage of it is that people could get the strain they really want to. The idea is, because we see on a legal market there is a limitation in broad varieties of different strains. So we believe that the Cannabis Social Club would actually be capable to cultivate cannabis like on demand, for people. And then the last part is actually creating the regular, recreational or adult use commercial, system of obtaining cannabis, like a legal market, basically.
So you think the social club model can happen concurrently with a license and at the same time as a license and
the idea is to promote it all together, like the three parts, that would be, people could actually, after the regulation, people could decide if they will either grow for themselves, or they will be a member of Cannabis Social Club, or, combination of it, or if they will just, as a regular thing, they will go to the market and just buy cannabis as they need. What we are focused on is protecting people from, let's say, risks while they would do the cannabis. Let's say there is a full focus on prevention and harm reduction services.
Right.
The idea is there will be certain limit that people could obtain like up to 100 grams per month.
Right.
So it will be limited.
Sure.
And the idea is that actually the weed would be, or cannabis would be of a good quality and would be clear when it comes from, would be the system, like from the seed to shelf, that people would know, like the whole system would know where the cannabis come from and how it, go through the regulatory system, so it will be protected from actually getting on an illicit market. And the idea is, that in the end it's supposed to bring some revenues, and actually,
And I think it does work, and I think with Europe's harm reduction strategies, I mean, the funny thing is in America, when we legalized under medical auspices, with de facto legalization in a lot of places, it wasn't regulated. It was kind of the wild west. And then when we legalized, it was super regulated, right? And it really kind of it disrupted the already existing markets. But in Europe, it's the opposite. You have a legal market that came out that's uber regulated, and now with the rec market, it won't be as regulated. One simple example is just it won't be we don't expect it to be GMP necessarily. So I find that a very interesting little caveat that just to put in y'all's minds. But with legalization, Katrina, we are in the UK, and I know a lot of us here are not from the UK, and we're very curious. I know that when I went from the airport to my town, my driver, or to my hotel, my driver into town, my driver couldn't drive over 20 miles an hour in the city, or it would be flash, 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 and you get all these tickets, right? Like Zurich, and I didn't know that it was. It felt a little bit police state here. I've lived in a lot of different countries, and I've lived in places that felt more like a police state. Like I live in Slovenia, it's not a police state like other, and then you go to Italy, and all of a sudden it feels like a more of a police state. But I'm wondering, the harms of cannabis prohibition and law enforcement have been not most, but I would say heavily, if not most, because obviously I don't know what the demographic makeup is of UK. So I'm super curious, but racialized communities have been affected by this and are going to jail for this. Not only going to jail more, but they get long. I know in America, if you see Michelle Alexander's new book, the New Jim Crow, we went from Jim Crow and to the Great Society, which would be when we started, the Nixon drug laws, right? And that basically still put people, racialized communities, in jail. So I'm just curious, can you share some of the data and your experiences in the UK specifically?
Yeah, so really pleasure and a privilege to be here sharing with you what is an injustice. I founded a non-profit organisation to challenge racial discrimination in policing and the criminal legal system because I'm a black woman and got very sick of seeing usually young black boys and men being thrown up against cars for the smell of cannabis. So cannabis is the leading in my opinion, and by the statistics, driving factor for racial disparities in our policing and criminal legal system. So as a black male, you're up to 9 times more likely to be stopped and searched for cannabis than your white counterparts. We just had the census of 2021. Was it 2020? I looked at the census status. We had about 2.9 million black people in the UK, about 4% of the population, and yet we're disproportionately being targeted for. So there's, I say disproportionately, meaning for the numbers of in the population to what we are, it's far too much. But I'm just going to use the word racist and discrimination because it talks to what it is. We are talking about people who look like me not having opportunities that people that look like you have because we're too busy getting round up by the police. So we're not allowed in rooms like this because we're seen as being criminal, whereas you guys are probably seen as being pioneering. And I think we really must challenge our perceptions about who uses cannabis, how our resources, especially in the UK, but this is across Europe. I think it's important because in the UK, we're fantastic at capturing data. We can tell you the numbers about who's going where. When I was in Madrid about 5 years ago, assisting the Madrid police with stop and search, they said we can't record ethnicity data. And this goes to the history of the Second World War and Nazi Germany and what happened, and there being real apprehension in recording how the state interacts with citizens, whether they be citizens that are there or residents of that country, and being told, oh, it's racist to record the ethnicity of citizens.
But yet if you don't, you won't get the real data of how it is actually being racist.
Or it's not racist that everybody you stop for cannabis happens to be Latino or black. You know, that was happening in Madrid, that, you know, you were not being stopped if you looked Spanish. What does a Spanish person look like? I could have been born in Spain. So it was about highlighting that in the UK, it is about the disproportionate impact on black communities. And I say racialized because what white people, Europeans have done is other anybody that's not them. So if you're in your home country, that racialized group may be Turkish people, it could be South American, it could be Senegalese, West African. But I think it's really incumbent on businesses and on governments to understand how prohibition has harmed communities and what will they be doing of their moral obligation to ensure that when these new legal systems come in place, that those same said communities are put at the forefront of equity, of redistribution of wealth, of equity of opportunity, because it isn't enough to say, okay, we're just not going to lock you up anymore. We have to have ways for those people to be entering the market, at the very least, or to be allowed to have their records expunged so that they can go into markets that they couldn't get jobs into because they had sold cannabis or been caught with cannabis. So the harms of prohibition are very much real, but what we can't do is ignore them because now we think it's legal or about to be decriminalized. Is how do we center our forward-thinking approach around the racialized communities that have been left behind for too long? And it's incumbent on all of us to do that, to be just as innovative with the tech, to be as innovative with the policies and processes that mean that we're no longer racist, unfair, and also picking on the working class people in your communities, because it is a racialized problem, but what we get into is classism. So you go to the communities where they're poor and poverty, and you start searching them for drugs and putting them in prison instead of giving them opportunity. So whilst there's a race issue to this, there's very much a class issue, and we must make sure that we don't perpetuate the harms that have been going on for hundreds and hundreds of years.
I love it, and I think expungement is so important because how can you legalize and then not have some type of expungement? Where I'm from in Oregon, we're kind of the poster boy child of cool shit, and when we legalized weed, basically, and we, you know, to a certain level, and you had to have a license, the cops just didn't. You could have like 20 kilos on you, and they just didn't care. All of a sudden, it wasn't probable cause. You know, that's a thing in America, and I'm really curious, Katrina, what is probable cause? Because as far as I know in Europe, you don't need shit for probable cause. A probable cause is an American thing, and of course you don't need it. You can always make it up. It can be.
It's called reasonable grounds here.
So reasonable grounds.
And that is very much at the officer's discretion of what they've seen. So they usually have to have seen you do something, have a reasonable belief that you have a prohibited article on you. But what we've seen time on time again is reasonable grounds has been the smell of cannabis, and obviously you can't prove if you can smell something or not, or it's been you live in a high crime area you're like, where in London doesn't have high crime? So there's the nuances and the words that they use are very covert and insidious, but basically,
High crime area.
high crime area,
It's a euphemism of the highest order, for sure.
high crime area, drug hotspot.
Drug hotspot.
But I will say, I don't think they do many searches in bank, and that's a big drug hotspot. I'm not, specialised in drugs, but if we talk about drug hotspots, what do you mean when you say a drug hotspot? And everybody knows cannabis smells. So you can see that it just reeking in the air, whereas if you're doing other drugs, you can do them in a different sort of way. So it comes back down to what are your policing priorities? What communities are you policing, or are you policing the plant?
Have you seen a low priority in anywhere in?
No, so it should be a low priority, and there are police forces in Durham across the country that have taken approaches. Thames Valley had a diversion scheme, but for us, we don't want the police involved at all.
Right.
Because once the police are involved, they're still involved. There's still intelligence gathering. There's still coercion involved when law enforcement is involved. So for us, decrim is the very first step to ensure the steps that we want to talk about here come forward, but it has to be decrim.
It has to, because you don't want a diversion. Like you get caught with weed and you still got to pay a fine and go to 3 classes on your Saturday when you're working 60 hours a week, and then you're still part of the system. Yeah, interesting. I didn't know a few of those things. Louis, back to you. Going back to the regulatory aspect of this, I'm curious, since you have so much experience in regulatory aspect of cannabis, what defines a successful legal market? And how can governments ensure their market meets their definition of success?
So I think a lot of times there's a lot of confusion around like how to define success and in the actions that government takes. And I think sometimes that they're so hotly debated that it's hard to come up with a number. Like we would like to see 40% less arrests, or we'd like to see a reduction in the amount of use of for young people. Those are really difficult numbers to arrive at agreement on. I think what you can agree on is some of the things that government can do to actually create the infrastructure to collect the data, so that as the current government, they can evaluate it, but as also for future governments to be able to analyze that data at the same time. So I think in a lot of ways, legalization has, in particular in some of the experiences I have in the US, they've, while not perfect, done a lot of work to create data infrastructure that can help inform the policy. Because when I think about legalization, usually the yes or no on should we legalize cannabis gets answered once for yes, and then cannabis legalization is there. As it continues to evolve over time and more data is collected, the conversation is more about like, how do we improve this? How do we involve this? Like, how can we make this better for communities in cities and in towns around the country? Or how can we improve the regulations around edibles so the product is safer? And how can we do that in a really efficient way where there's still sustainable business options to exist? And so I think in a lot of ways, legalization has defined success as its ability to be able to collect data on all of those things I mentioned before, but also too, in my current role, we're really focused on collecting data throughout the supply chain. So everything from really small baby plants or even sometimes seeds, all the way to the point of sale where it's purchased by a consumer, and better understanding, what kind of processes are utilized to ensure the safety of product, but what are some of the trends that we're seeing? Are we seeing more trends towards smokable cannabis? Are we seeing trends more towards edibles? If so, what kind of edibles? What kind of impact or what kind of market share do these vaping products have in the market? So when we start really thinking about defining success, our government's ability to work again with that broader stakeholder group to develop the right data points, so that over time the concepts or the constructs that create legalization can be reevaluated and evolve to address new problems that manifest themselves over time.
That sounds pretty nimble for government. Is that actually happening anywhere?
Well, when you put it that way, it does sound kind of idealistic, but we've actually seen it happen, right? So we've seen this replicated many times in the U.S., where government has chosen to create public-private partnerships, where you have a combination of interested citizen groups industry, which by the way is not monolithic. Like there's a lot of things that happen, or there's a lot of differences of opinion, both from like cultivations versus manufacturers versus stores on how regulations should be created. But we've seen those groups come together in a way that is like been really productive in collecting data and then evaluating over time. What I do know is like that I'm aware of, there hasn't been a adult use market, for example, or like a significant commercial medical market in the US that's been completely rolled back. Right, that just hasn't happened. So what society in these various states have decided is that we're going to continue to improve and evolve it over time, and really the key to that is making sure you're collecting the right data.
Fascinating. But there are some examples of where that's happening. Can you list any states for us? Well, you think who's doing a great job in the states that we can look to as a beacon of hope and inspiration?
Well, I think, this is going to sound a little bit self-serving, but I mean, I think Colorado did a really good job, like kind of like as one of the first states to legalize, and so it's also part of my legacy. So I also, I know that when I'm saying that, I recognize that. I think we did a really good job setting up the infrastructure to start collecting data. And I think what that did, in some ways, like there were some other states that followed in close proximity to us, like Oregon and Washington. And what we were able to do is start to collect data, make informed decisions. But as later adopting states came on board, they were able to adopt a lot of those best practices, so that we could also focus on other issues that were really emerging and kind of like percolating to the top, like patient access to medicine and recreational programs, social justice issues that we didn't really address early on that we probably should have, but we created some space for a lot of those things to be able to happen, and then even focus on the data constructs that are going to be needed for those.
Do my European counterparts on stage here feel that Europe, in its kind of bureaucratic, ness, can be nimble also in this regard? You guys have hope for that at all?
Because of Brexit, I'm not going to say much.
Would that make you more nimble or less nimble?
I'd hope it'd make us more, because we don't have to go with everybody else. But
that's what
our current government seems to not be nimble, or we've had quite a few in the last couple of years. So.
No, exactly. We thought it would be, and then it wasn't, and then you see the same old shit kind of. Well, if medical is the for the Great Britain or England specifically, if medical is the precursor to legalization here, what do you think? Can we just legalize in Great Britain, or Katya, is medical the predicate or precursor to legalization still? And if so, do we need to increase the amount of medical patients before you think the tipping point for legalization will happen?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that increasing the number of medical patients to a point where the government's like, okay, well, we may as well just legalize recreationally, because we've got, X hundreds of thousands of patients, but there's obviously a lot of work to be done up until that point. And I guess this gets into that. I know that there's a panel on medical versus recreational, I think later in the conference, so I don't want to get into that too much, but I do think that, we get to a point where there's a bit of an uncomfortable truth to face around, medical cannabis versus recreational cannabis, and where we kind of draw that line in the sand around who is a medical patient and who's a recreational user, because I think it can be quite difficult to distinguish.
I do too.
But I definitely think that expanding the number of medical patients needs to happen, and is the way to kind of move that forward. I know I mentioned before around kind of a public awareness campaign and education being really, really important, and I stand by that. We're seeing kind of small awareness campaigns run by some of the industry groups and clinics, but I think what we need to see is something more on a national scale to really increase patient numbers and reduce, the 80% of the population that has no idea that medical cannabis is legal.
Yeah, that makes sense. Robert, what about Czech Republic? Can they just go legal, or do they need? I look at the Czech Republic as having a better chance almost to go legal than to have this robust medical thing. But what do you think?
There was this survey done 2 years ago, in which was found that almostly 10% of a population was actually entering black market or doing like criminal act by getting cannabis on an illicit market or growing themselves. And from that, like it was like 800,000 people, and from that, almost like 500,000, which is in 10 million nation is quite some.
What was the survey? What was the question for the survey?
There was how people if they're interested in cannabis and how they actually where they obtain it, where they get it, and there 500,000 people were more into like medicinal cannabis, or they were looking for cannabis as a possible treatment, like self-medicating. So it's a quite big number of people who are actually recognized by the nowadays law as a criminals. So that's what we see as a biggest problem, that like people, if they want to and they're really into it, into cannabis, they should be allowed to have it. Obviously, I mean, there should be like constitutional right to grow plants for yourself, or to obtain it, and not to seen as a criminal. Because we say, or it's said that if there is a law which a lot of people do not obey, it's not because the people don't want to do something criminal, but because the law is wrong. We see, and it's proven that the prohibition itself is not actually helping anything. It's not serving as it's supposed to. Like creating the world without drugs it's impossible. That the concept is wrong, and that we have to search for like decent and proper, just and effective legislation which allowed like everybody to feel comfortable and to be able to live just decent life.
So is that going to happen through medical or legal, or what will?
That in medical it was partly. In medical cannabis, it was partly done, but the problem is medical. There are certain issues related to medical cannabis. You have to be like, you need certain diagnosis. It has to be proven that the conventional medicine doesn't help. It's like sort of a last add medicine.
I think maybe just legalization, right? Just boom. Which might be a different dynamic than the UK, for example.
So we believe that actually extension of the medicinal, it's just a regular adult use market,
Yes,
which is supposed to be created.
Yes, sir.
Can I just say, with the medical argument, if we know that we have communities that have been racialized, othered by the state, and then we enable cannabis to come in through another state agency such as health, if you don't trust the state, it doesn't matter if it's education, policing, or health, you don't trust the state. So how do we ensure that those communities that have been over-policed or stigmatized will want to go to their doctors to use it via that way? Because I'd be really keen to know, out of all those 20,000 people, how many of them are non-white British, and that sort of stuff.
I mean, with that, the cost argument's really, really pertinent, because, at the moment, and for a while, we'll still see a private healthcare model for medical cannabis in the UK, because, the NHS won't support prescribing yet. It's still an unlicensed, controlled medicine. So, yeah, I feel like that's a whole other panel to discuss there.
No, but do we have any statistics on the racial composition of people?
I don't think we do, because all the data isn't public, because it's all private prescriptions. I don't think there's a register to be able to see what those statistics are. But in short, I would assume a very small percentage. Yeah.
And Katrina, just lastly, how can we start to build the relationship with our disenfranchised communities to trust the government? Because I'm not from a disenfranchised community, and I don't trust the government. So
I think it's not about the community trusting the government. It's about governments being held accountable and being transparent in their actions. So it's not for me to tell any community to trust your government. It's for the government to show why they should be trusted. And if the government can't show why it should be trusted, don't trust it. Sorry. It's as simple as that. But it's the onus is on the state to show what it's doing, not on communities to just give trust. It doesn't work like that.
Well said. Ladies and gentlemen, give it up for our esteemed panel. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, you guys. I appreciate it.